My name is Anna Miti, and I officially welcome you to the program, The Big Question. As I mentioned earlier today that we're talking about democracy and development. So with me in the studio, very distinguished guest. He's been all over the world, having been traveling in more than 101 countries, where he gets to talk about this issue and others. His name is Professor Dr. Peter Baofu, who's written over 150 books that looks at the social sciences, the humanities, the natural sciences, and the formal sciences in relation to the mind, the social, the society, nature, and culture. And he also looks at his visions of what the future of humanity is like. In your view, when you hear people talking about democracy and development in currently as we stand, and people say that there's no democracy in Africa, or their vision of what democracy should look like, in your view, what is on the ground at the moment in terms of democracy and development?
I just want to make a few clarifications first in that question, because it has some certain assumptions which can be quite questionable and misleading. And number one is that democracy is a question about politics.
Yes.
Development is a question about economics. So you do not confuse politics and economics. Are they related? Of course they are.
Yes.
They are related, but you should not confuse between the two. That is the first clarification. Clarification number one is that many of the discussions about democracy and development have been quite Western-centric. For example, in terms of development, people often use Western standards. As a modernization nowadays, you have to be modernized. In many cases, that means you have to be like the Western world. And in many other cases too, in case of democracy, when you talk about democratic, they often mean the Western standards, which means that you have to be like the liberal democratic institution in America or in Western Europe or something like that. I think that is very misleading, but also very dangerous to have this kind of thinking, because you are imposing values and beliefs on one region of the world on the rest of the world, and that is not going to solve many of the problems that we face nowadays in humanity, because many of those problems are not just international but also local. So you have to understand both of them in order to have a good solution to many of these issues in the longer term. Africa is no exception about that.
So talk about development now. You mentioned in the beginning that development being an economic concept, but a lot of it is westernized at the moment. The way we look at it, we have scholars like Amartya Sen, who then says, let's not look at it strictly from a Western perspective. In your view, what is currently obtaining and how can it be fixed?
I also disagree with the notion developed by Sen. I think that is also not very useful. In fact, in my book, I'm talking about development or actual development. That is the keyword that I propose in my book. I question many of these assumptions about development, and including the notion of development as freedom that you talk about, Sen. I also disagree about that. I think many of these are not just very useful to understand contemporary issues. Many of these issues are just cliches, out of date now, and we are just clinging on that. I think that we have to look more into the question and what I call in my book actual development, in the sense that we have to go beyond the concept of development to develop society. Many of the concepts that we are talking about right now, in one way or the other, are Western-centric.
Yes. And
sometimes we don't know how much we are entrapped into this kind of discourse, and in the end we are not really fixing many of the problems. And that's why in Africa is a good example, that we still have so many problems after all these years of talking about development, and there are so many models about that, and many of them are all messed up. We need to go beyond this kind of understanding of development and balance the so-called golden standard. The golden standard, by the way, in many ways is the death sentence to Africa.
Yes, especially when you then look at issues to do with land, and the liberalization that you're talking about. We are coming from a perspective where colonization happened in Africa. We cannot, there's no way we can forget about that. But one of the things that, for example, Zimbabwe is facing right now is the issue of sanctions. And one of the things that are being talked about in trying to get rid of those sanctions from the US is the issue of land and letting people freely trade in land, and the land that was appropriated during the land reform program to be given back or some sort of compensation happening there. Your views regarding those things, the African aspect, the issues that we are talking about here in Zimbabwe, for example, the land.
Yeah. Just to make the first qualification, which is very important because I'm an American, I do not want to intervene into the domestic affairs of other countries because I think that this is one of the things that we have been accused a lot. So I try to stay out of politics in this case, and I'm not going to pinpoint any government, any politicians about you are bad or you are corrupt or you are this and this. I stay out of it. Now, having said that, I just want to answer your question in a scholarly perspective without pinpointing or fingering. I think that in the case of Zimbabwe, also in Southern Africa in this case, one of the most important issues that you need to look into is to ask the question, what exactly is the African identity, in this case the identity in Zimbabwe, because that is the driving point for you to know what exactly do you want. Let me give you one example. If I want to be a boxer, if this is my passion in life, so if my mother and my father or my friend ask me, okay, what do you want to do in life? I say, oh, I want to be a boxer. Why? Because that is exactly what I want to do, my physiology, my makeup, my psychology. I just want to be like that. Now, if you have that identity, then you develop that identity based on your ambition and the vision to be a great boxer by analogy. So what exactly is the identity in Africa? Okay. What exactly would define you and say, I am an African, I'm a black, I'm a person in Zimbabwe, and this A, B, C, D, and D is exactly what I want to do, not because I want to copy the Chinese or the European or the American or the Japanese or the Indian, but this is exactly what I want to do as an African in Zimbabwe. Now, once you can define that, whatever it is, now development will be on the basis of that identity as a driving point. Now, unless you answer the question, if you don't have that kind of identity, you will end up borrowing from the so-called golden standard, and you get poorer and poorer and poorer year after year and after year, and the international institution will ask you to do this and this and this, because in many ways it's Western-centric, it's dominated by the West in this case. So I think that for African countries, you need to answer the question. Look at China as a good example. I mentioned this in China too. China is developing a new way to do development, which is not Western-centric. Now China is becoming the dominant superpower, is replacing America in many ways. And that's why Trump is so upset about it. I can understand why he's so upset about it. But the point over here is, think about it. You can learn something from it. It doesn't mean that you are going to behave like Chinese. You will never behave like a Chinese, and they will never behave like an African. You are totally different. But you can learn from each other in that way. They have a Chinese identity. They know what to do for China. And they develop that based on their own culture, society, nature, and the mindset. Now they are developing something which is totally new, which is not Western-centric in that sense. Now, all of a sudden, there are two rivals. They are competing for international domination in a certain sense, the US and China. How about that? The rise of Africa in major ways will be determined by that kind of driving point. So what is the driving point? That is the beginning of the conversation that should be based on that sense.
All right, in case you just tuning in, you are listening to The Big Question, and I do have with me in the studio Professor Dr. Peter Baofu. He's an author, he's an academic, he's written over 150 books, and he also has put forward more than 116 theories and visions that pertain to human future. And we're just looking at the issues of democracy, development, and other things related to to humanity in Africa at the moment, because that's what we are discussing. But it's been in over 100 countries putting forward these visions and these theories. Now, Professor Baofu, you mentioned here China. As you know, scholars that look at modernization, putting forward theories of post-modernization, often give an example of China and how it has not followed the development pattern that has been put forward from the Western perspective. And you mentioned lessons. What do you think are the lessons that Africa, and maybe in particular Zimbabwe, can actually learn from the Chinese way of moving forward and getting to development?
Okay. 2 points very quickly on my side. Point number one is that to learn from others, it doesn't mean that you have to copy them. Even when Africa wants to learn from China, from America, or from anyone else, remember, you cannot just take over the program and try to dress that yourself, because you are not one of them.
Yes.
So that is mean that you are going to commit the same mistake all over again. So to learn from them simply means to learn from something good that you may learn from them, but in the end remember who you are. So that is very important. That means that that's only up to a certain point that you can learn. Beyond that, you have to do your own things. Unless you do your own things, you cannot be the center. Remember, when you learn from others, you are always behind, because you are copying them.
Okay.
You are not advancing yourself. You want to be the center. You want the new guy who is the big guy, the dominant one. Then you have to create things yourself. But if you keep copying, then that means that you are always condemned to be behind them. So, but that's not what you want in the end. So point number one. Point number two, you talk about modernization and post-modernization. Now, in my book, The Future of Human Civilization, I propose that we have to go beyond post-modernization too. Post-modernity. I propose what I call in that book, after post-modernity, after post-modernization, and after post-modernism. And what China is doing, and India, by the way, is the next that I talk about in those publications, is that they are questioning some of these fundamental assumptions about development. In this case, let's say that nowadays I propose a new understanding, what I call the post-democracy and post-capitalism. Those are the two visions of the future, such that many of the discussion about democracy that you just mentioned and development that you just mentioned had to be superseded. And I'm predicting that these two foundations, one in economics, the other one in politics, will not last. I mean, democracy and capitalism in this case. It will be replaced by what I call post-democracy and post-capitalism. And there are many different versions of that. And the Chinese example is a good example. They are proposing a new way of doing development, which does not follow the golden standard of the West.
Interesting. So take us through the theories that you're putting forward for post development, for post-modernization that you mentioned here.
Maybe I can show you some example. Many people try to, in the case of China, they try to develop in a way that they don't depend on the notion of dependency. This is one of the driving ideologies, let's say in the after the Cold War, and nor they depend on the liberal democratic, the capitalistic, the market reform that you have been talking about, for example. They try to stay away from that too. So what they are doing is that they mix between the two, but in the end with Chinese characteristics. For example, the government come in, for example, to help the economy to manage this and this and this. They plan ahead. But in a way, they are not like the communistic economic system, which they also rejected. But on the other hand, they are not like the American capitalistic system, which they also reject too. Yeah. So it's very interesting. They mix something, they learn something about, but on the other hand, many of the way that they do is very Chinese. So it's very difficult for you to come in and say, let's copy the Chinese success and Africa will become 1 and 2, but you are not going to copy like that, because in many ways that's also very Chinese. Another example, you talk about democracy. Think about this. The Chinese political system does not become liberal democratic. Let's say that you see in America, in the West. Why? It's very Chinese. The Chinese don't think like that. They don't behave like a Western a political agent in the way that, let's say, tomorrow if you have a problem, they protest on the street, they have mass demonstration, they have riots and all that. They don't do any of this. The Chinese way of looking into politics is very different. It's very Chinese. People used to think in the West that, oh, that's because the Chinese are persecuted, are suppressed by the government. No, even the Chinese themselves don't like this kind of behavior. In fact, every time when they see some people rioting, protesting on the street, the Chinese look at these people and say, look at the way that they behave. We don't want to be like that. So don't think that it's just a question that, oh, the government is suppressing things. No, even the Chinese themselves don't like any of this. Their way of thinking in many ways is very Chinese, but we are still learning from them. And that's why the West has a lot to catch up. We judge other people constantly on the Western golden standard. That's why we don't understand them. We still do not understand the Chinese. Now they are becoming more and more the dominant superpower, the new center of power, the new center of science and innovation coming from China now. But we are still behind. We are still thinking of them as like, oh, communistic, they copy, they are nothing and all this kind of talk, undemocratic and all that, dictatorial, a dictator and all that. These kind of ideas are Western propaganda. We don't understand them. They are just an alien race. We were still using all this kind of stereotype to understand them, and that's why we are so far behind. Now, I talk about in my publication the decline of the West, the decline of America. It's time to catch up, to understand them. They are not what we think they are. So get rid of this kind of golden standard that you are talking about. Modernization, post-modernization, all this, by the way, is also Western-centric.
Yes.
Just in case you do not know. These are Western ideas.
I'm looking at it from a perspective of how would it look like in practical terms in Africa. In a system where people are used to doing trade.
Yeah.
As an example, our currencies are actually based on the US dollar, and but we know that it's not the strongest of the market, but it's just the world systems. The way the world systems are. We farm our cotton, we sell it to America, we get US dollars, we buy things. That's almost like in every other African country. This is what you're looking at. So the post development that you're mentioning here, how would it look like from a perspective of Africa? How would it work?
Okay. Quickly to just make a small clarification. Actual development is not post-development or post-development, because if you do that, then you are committing the same mistake that people did before. So what I'm trying to say is that I want to transcend that altogether. I just want to get away from it. So it's not that I want to have post, just make some revision, and then another post, just make another revision. I just want to get away all together from that. It's just a trash. I don't want the trash anymore. It's not that I have some romantic nostalgic just to revise it, like Marxism, people like neo-Marxism or post-Marxism.
I'm not going to ask whether you
I go beyond all of that. Neither Marxist, neither communist, nor capitalistic, neither or, nor, not either or. That kind of dichotomy is very rigid. In many ways, it's part of the Western thinking for hundreds of years now. Either or.
Yeah,
it
has to be something.
Either or, either you are guilty or you are innocent, you are evil or you are bad, you are God or you are devil. Can you think about this and say, look, I'm not God, I'm not the devil too. I'm not good, but I'm not bad also. Can you think beyond that? So I'm trying to say that that's why I propose another theory, which is called dialectic, existential dialectics, is to transcend this kind of thinking, either or. We need to get out. By the way, what the Chinese way of doing and thinking is very interesting. Their thinking is not like that. In a way, they are transcending it too, but not in the way that I'm proposing. The way that I'm proposing is also transcending the Chinese model too.
Okay.
So I'm proposing something even farther in the future about the humanity and then how things are going to get involved. See, the Chinese, the way they do a thing, if you pay attention to the way they talk, they don't talk like modernity, post-modernity and all that. Their own way of thinking is very different, mixing the Chinese one and some other ones. So I'm proposing that I am seeing as some of the forces emerging nowadays in the world, which is shaping the economic, political, and many other indicators. And that is going to change the world that we are thinking of. In the case of Africa that you just mentioned, as I said before, my problem is not about trade. You can trade as much as you like. But I'm just saying that what are you going to trade with, and what do you export, what do you import, how are you going to produce them? So my problem is not that you should not trade or you should trade or you should stay at home. That's not my point. My point is you want to trade fine, but my question to you is what do you want Zimbabwe to export and what do you want Zimbabwe to import? Now, are you going to do the same thing that you have been repeating? There's something about land, by the way. How do you manage land? Are you going to kick out all the white farmers? Is that a good solution? Or you're going to say that, for example, you should invite them back, as the new government have been thinking? My point is not that you have to do any of them. My point is that it's time for you to examine the question of identity. The question of identity here, in many ways, is based on the culture, society, nature, and the mind, the four categories that I just mentioned. That is a way to answer that question. When you answer that question, you say, okay, for Zimbabwe, I think that we should export A, B, and C, but not C, D, and E, and we should import J, F, and G, but not H, I, and J, whatever that might be. Now, if you mix them up, then you will commit the same mistakes again. But how you will find out what A, B, C, D, E, F, G? That is the question that the people in Zimbabwe have to answer for themselves. And I don't think that you should go to the Western NGOs, the UN, the IMF, the World Bank. Now they have the Chinese Investment Bank. I don't think that you should go to them and ask them what you should do, because they will be imposing their views on you again.
Yes.
It's another form of the post-colonial, however you call it, post-colonial, maybe post-colonial.
Yeah.
I don't care how you call it, but the point is that it's time for you to say, what exactly are you?
Interesting. So in over 100 countries, and we're glad to have you here in Zimbabwe. What would you say to the Zimbabweans who are listening right now, the message that you want to leave them with this evening?
Again, I don't want to intervene into the domestic affairs of other countries, but I just want to say something more scholastic, more scholarly, as a professor, not as a politician.
Yes.
I do think that it's also time for people in Zimbabwe to find out what I just said before. What exactly is your identity on many issues? Not so much on the basis of what you should learn from the golden standard, or every time when you do something you always go to the golden standard, go to other powers and ask them, okay, what do you think we should do? You go to the NGO, the Western NGO, and or now you go to China and you some always trying to copy from others. But what exactly do you do? Because the more you copy from others, the more you will not be able to develop yourself fully. So it's time for you to ask the question. If you answer them, I think that's the big beginning for Africa. But I do think that they will eventually answer the question.
All right, Professor Dr. Peter Baofu is an author, a scholar, and many, many things. And he was here to answer the big question that we had for you this evening. Do stand by for the news bulletin at 8 coming up next.